This is Chris Hedges, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman and Hannah Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
I surprised you.
You surprised me.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. We're going to find out what some young people are doing around the country to build the future and make a better society.
That's right, Ralph. Today's show is focusing on the promise of young people organizing for good. Our first guest, Sam Simon, is going to give us an historical perspective. He's going to take us back to the early 1970s and the birth of the modern consumer movement, when a group of young advocates rallied around a common cause and a charismatic leader named Ralph Nader. They each took on a policy issue: tax reform, pension rights, technology, communications, and juvenile justice reform, to name just a few. They helped prove it's possible to make real and lasting improvements in the lives of millions of Americans and make an honest living doing it. They share their stories in a new book, Choosing the Public Interest: Essays from the First Public Interest Research Group. Sam Simon compiled these stories to challenge today's young people to make the pursuit of positive social change their life's work too. One way that work is being carried on is through the Public Interest Research Group, or PIRGs, a movement that started on individual college campuses and is now a national organization that is part of the Public Interest Network. Our second guest, Lisa Frank, is Vice President and D.C. Director at the Public Interest Network, and she's going to tell us about PIRG's many strategic campaigns to protect America's oceans, forests, and public lands. And we will conclude today by welcoming back frequent guest, journalist Chris Hedges, who's been reporting extensively on the ongoing genocide in Gaza. In a recent piece for the Chris Hedges Report entitled "The Nation's Conscience," he visits college campuses and writes about the courageous stance that students across the country have taken in defiance of genocide. Most mainstream reporting focuses on the heavy-handed institutional response to student activism and the counter-protesters that have been attacking peaceful encampments. But while we're all debating these campus showdowns, we're not talking about what these students are actually trying to say. Mr. Hedges argues that their words are the ones we most need to hear. As always, somewhere along the line, we'll check in with our resolute corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's find out how a previous generation of young people were able to make a difference. David?
Sam Simon is an author, playwright, and attorney who founded the Public Interest Research Group with Ralph and the other Nader's Raiders back in 1970. He's the editor of a new book, Choosing the Public Interest: Essays from the First Public Interest Research Group. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Sam Simon.
Thank you very much, and thanks for featuring this, Ralph. Glad to be with you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Well, just by way of introduction, this was an extraordinary period for public interest law. It was 1970. The Vietnam War was underway, and the auto safety laws had been passed in 1966. And there were all kinds of opportunities in Congress at that time to pass other laws to protect consumers, workers, the environment. And so I thought it'd be a good idea to bring some young law school graduates together in a group I called the Public Interest Research Group. And we rented a floor in an office building, kitty corner from the Washington Post in downtown Washington. And they all came in, and I had them in the main entrance, sitting in chairs in a circle. And I was in the middle, and I had a whole list of reforms to work on. And I asked them, who wants to take this one and who wants to take that one? I remember that so clearly because some of the young lawyers who took these issues on stayed with them for 50 years, which we'll talk about. Their whole career went in that direction. And some of the subjects were worker health and safety. That was Gary Sellers. He was already a lawyer, a few years out of law school. Others were the Federal Trade Commission. Others were the status of the civil service. Others was pensions reform, the Federal Trade Commission, and so forth. So, with that introduction, Sam, you wanted to put all this together in a book, and you interviewed a lot of these public interest advocates many, many years later. So, tell us about those early days and why everybody was so motivated and everybody got their calls returned, it seemed, in those days from Congress and government agencies, in contrast to today. Give us a sense what it was like.
Well, Ralph, in our short time, I urge people to get the book because there are moving and amazing stories from those of us who are still around. And also, two of the authors have passed away since it was done, Don Ross and Karen Ferguson. The stories are just of that, Ralph. What brought people, what moved them? And they're amazing stories that, first of all, there were a lot. You were well known and you were speaking on campuses, and the unrest around them and inside of people. It was in some ways a time like now where the world seemed uncertain for people, and they were moved by your message, and they each took, you will read, a big risk in their life. You know, somebody who had already an offer from a Wall Street firm, somebody was going to do something else. And the idea of modeling the success that you were having and making a difference in Washington moved each of them. We've been trying to keep people together. Everybody who came and started then and stayed in doing advocacy of some sort for a very long time. I am amazed by the stories, slightly different, and there was a call by each author of follow your passion.
Let's take a few and make it pretty concrete. Let's start with Robert Vaughn from Oklahoma.
Bob Vaughn from Oklahoma. He was getting his master's at Harvard in law. His advice, and I love it, I was just rereading today, is Bob Vaughn tells us that accept your calling. There's a side of you can do a plus and minus thing and cost effectiveness. The calling is, what should I be doing? And he could feel that. And he describes how he came to Washington, worked, and started in whistleblowing, started listening and finding other people. He also says that he was astounded how people would return his phone call when he said, and I'm working with Ralph Nader. So he had his phone calls returned. But he then describes I think it's almost like an exit interview with you, Ralph, where you were urging him to go into another public interest group. He wanted to go teach. And in his teaching, he was able to incent young people as they came on and continue to do his advocacy work, particularly about whistleblowing, the federal bureaucracy, and it's not even the civil service. That work in reforming civil service isn't about bureaucracy. And this is from his piece, making the government work well for the people and how it saves lives when the civil service works well. You know, you have somebody out there today who wants to get rid of that. And in fact, working on the civil service and making it work well saves lives, gets life-saving regulations to work as they are intended and should.
And he became the world's leading expert on whistleblowing laws all over the country, at the state level and all over the world, and wrote a book on it. Robert Vaughn, and a longtime professor at American University Law School, recently retired.
He also was a professor for my son. I think that's important. From generation to generation.
Yes. Let's go to Karen Ferguson. She picked pensions.
Yes. Karen picked pensions and created an institutional infrastructure for that advocacy work that exists to today and has had a huge impact on the safety and care with which pensions are handled through corporations as well as the government. And it provided a voice for the person receiving it, not the corporation that was creating it. I wish we could calculate the billions of dollars saved for people's pensions through work for her. Very modest woman who was a lawyer and dedicated and focused on making sure it works. And importantly, as important as your work, she's left a legacy of people in charge, and she's one who has passed away. The organization goes beyond her, honoring her memory.
And Karen and I institutionalized her work in creating the Pension Rights Center, which you can go to now. It's operating and thriving Pension Rights Center in Washington, D.C. How about Chris White?
Chris White. You know, by the way, Chris and I and Bob, 50 some odd years later, have been having lunch once a month with each other. I love how our work together with you, Ralph, has made close personal friends, along with Tom Stanton. Chris ended up retiring as the longest serving employee of the Federal Trade Commission. He did leave a little bit earlier than most of us, but he went to work at the Federal Trade Commission with folks like then Mike Perchuk, who I work with, and was able to stay in. And with his work and his passion, help keep the Federal Trade Commission in a positive, you know, a major force for consumer protection as well as competition. And again, his work with us and with you helped in many ways. The passion that we can develop in working, I think it's important to notice. And I think a lot of students and a lot of law students have that, and they're sometimes afraid to follow it. And I think all those people who were fortunate enough to start back in that day, in that time, were able to tap into that. And one of your talents, Ralph, was to encourage people and help them find that.
Let's go to Donald Ross, who's the chief organizer of all the public interest research groups from New York and Massachusetts to California and other states.
You remember, Ralph, for years, you said 2 went north and 2 went south. You sent us out
Yes.
with the idea of getting the college environment and students to organize, and you know, they were putting money into a student fund, use that money to create student activists. Donald and Jim Welch, the late Jim Welch, he passed away early on in this, but went north. Myself and Chris White went south. And at the last sort of Eugene, Oregon stop, Donald and I think Jim was with them, found a resonance. And out of that has come the Public Interest Network, which, by the way, is the publisher of this book. And you can get copies of the book through their choosethepublicinterest.org. And Don made it his career. He was the largest figure or individual who helped figure out the systems, how you had to work within the college bureaucracies. He became the executive director at NYPIRG, New York Public Interest Research Group, and along with others, but his imagination of how it could sustain itself and the power and impact it can have in the community. He then took it on to other public interest activities in his career. But he, along with you and the others, took that idea of enabling the student. And this is something that every one of these themes have, and that this movement has had, that the consumer, the user, the student, the pensioner have equal voice in our systems to help create the systems that are intended to benefit them and not leave that power in the hands of corporate entities and profit-making enterprises. And that idea needs to continue to exist. And I'm glad that the Public Interest Network and PIRGs still thrive in many campuses.
Well, you have these profiles based on interviews that you conducted with your colleagues in the first and second public interest research groups, 1970, 1971. They were multipliers. They multiplied their civic passion with the students and citizens that they helped mobilize. They like to start new citizen groups that still exist today around the country. And the question I have of you, Sam, is why are we having so much trouble finding people like that today? What do you think is the difference? We really couldn't have done today what we did in 1970 and 71.
Ralph, I think it is a more complicated and different time, and I do think it is still possible. I think it is different. One of the biggest complexities is this new technology, metaverse, to use that term, or universe, that has complicated how people communicate, get news, the risk of, even AI, where you could press false information. When we were working, we could talk to reporters and millions of people would get the products. We put how to pick a long distance company sounds simple now. It was brand new. And Sylvia Porter mentioned it. And we got thousands of envelopes with a dollar bill on it, send it to me. That's how people were getting information. And I think that as we understand how to use this technology better, I don't want to be that discouraged. I think putting out these books, creating the imagination and most importantly, encouraging people. What I want to come out of this book is that average kids from average backgrounds ended up doing amazing things with their entire life because of the opportunity and the vision that they could do that. And you helped give that to us, that we could make that difference. And we need your voice still and new voices, the groups that are out there that are still doing the public citizen that's out there, the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, giving people the opportunity and a positive voice. Don't worry. We hear the high debt. I got to tell you, I showed up for work with a wife and a brand new baby and no friggin' idea how I was going to make a living. Every one of these people who you will read about started with basically nothing and have had enormously meaningful careers. They're financially secure. They're not billionaires, but that's not the objective. They've got meaningful lives, careers, and families, and have helped make the world better for everyone else living in it. And young people can still today do that. And that's what I hope.
And you helped record that wonderful history in this book, Choosing the Public Interest, essays from the first public interest research group. They all remembered, they all gave you interviews, Karen Ferguson, Charlene Krantz, Peter Petkus, Donald Ross, Karen Sheldon, Sam Simon, Thomas Stanton, Robert Vaughn, Chris White, and Joan Woodward, and the late Gary Sellers, who was a little older than all of you, worked with me on Capitol Hill to establish OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that passed in late 1970. So people, if you want to get this book, Sam will tell you how to get it. It's a book of great inspiration that people who are not only idealistic, but they put their ideals to work to help change the country for the better.
Sure. Again, you can go to the website called choosethepublicinterest.org. Parents, give it to your children. Folks in college, young people, you can today do the same thing. And it is as urgent as ever, Ralph. Today feels like it was 54 years ago as we were beginning the work in the middle of a lot of turmoil.
On that optimistic note, and you're always optimistic, Sam, properly so, we have to conclude. Remember, if you want to motivate your young people in your lives, this is a great book. It's very personal, recollections, personal history, well documented. In those critical years, 1970, 71, when the great civil rights, environmental, women's rights, peace movements were underway, not to mention the consumer protection initiatives. Thank you very much, Sam Simon.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Sam Simon. We will link to the new book, Choosing the Public Interest, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, let's find out how that small group of young advocates in 1970 transformed into a sustainable movement that carries on this important work. David?
Lisa Frank is Vice President and D.C. Director at the Public Interest Network. She is also Executive Director in the Washington Legislative Office at Environment America, where she directs strategy and staff for federal campaigns. Ms. Frank has won millions of dollars in investments in walking, biking, and transit, and has helped develop strategic campaigns to protect America's oceans, forests, and public lands from drilling, logging, and road building. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Lisa Frank.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Lisa. Just by way of history, listeners, this whole public interest research group movement started with what Sam Simon described as two young lawyers going through the states all the way to the West Coast and the northern part of the United States, and two going in the southern part of the United States at universities and colleges, trying to see if their interest in forming independent, student-run, nonprofit public interest research groups where the students would collect dues, either student government dues or for a student referendum, $4 or $5 a year per student, and fund these groups to hire lawyers and writers and authors and organizers to improve things in their state and country. So Donald Ross and I went around the country after the exploratory trip I just described, and it started catching on in Oregon. So Oregon Student Public Interest Research Group was started in the early 70s, and then it caught on in Minnesota, and then it caught on in about 15 to 20 states, New York, Massachusetts, Michigan, Florida, and other states. And then at a certain time, which Lisa will tell us about, they decided to get together and start a national group called the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, or U.S. PIRG. And all the PIRGs meet in Aspen about once a year to motivate each other, inform each other, develop more resolve on more issues. And at the state level, they often have civic training sessions. And once in a while, faculty will give course credit to students, for example, who work at the state level and get a bill passed, such as a hearing aid reform bill for elderly people in New York State. So with that background, what's the scene now, Lisa Frank?
Yes, thank you, Ralph. Well, and I'll say I'm proud to hail from Oregon, home of that very first student PIRG. Unfortunately, I went to school out of state, so didn't get a chance to be an OSPIRG student myself, but they are still going strong, and it's great to work with them. So today, what we consider the PIRG movement includes state public interest research groups in more than 20 states that are advocating day in and day out in the state capitals, as well as with companies in that state, on campuses, and in your local cities and counties for public interest policies that protect our health, our safety, and our well-being. We also, the student PIRGs, have chapters in 28 states and altogether are active on about 100 campuses all across the country, working to, again, tackle these public interest issues and train students in the skills and knowledge that they need to be lifelong public interest advocates, like those of us here on the call. And as you mentioned, we have the U.S. PIRG, Federal Lobbying Office, here in Washington, D.C., that makes sure that all of our voices and those of our state offices and our members are heard in the halls of power here in Washington when they're debating these important issues.
And then you had a big spinoff, the environmental group, a few years ago. I was astonished how large it was, over 50 people, I'm told. Tell us about that group, from a spinoff from the U.S. Public Interest Research Group.
Sure. So over the years, we've often seen new needs or opportunities to tackle challenges facing us in regards to the issue that PIRG's worked on, whether that's new environmental challenges or new places that we want to do this kind of work, whether that's, creating a new organization that's focused on convincing companies to adopt better policies, or founding a few decades back the National Environmental Law Center to enhance our ability to use the courts to fight for common sense environmental protections under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And a couple decades ago, we decided that we should create a new organization, both state organizations and a new national organization, to be the home of PIRG's purely environmental work. PIRG, of course, works on a really wide range of issues. We work to protect consumers, first and foremost. We safeguard democracy. We work to protect public health. The environment is a piece of that as well. But we found that many people across this country relate really strongly to environmental issues and care a lot about clean air, clean water, open spaces. And we thought we could have more impact by having an organization that was really focused on that. So first we created Environment California and a few other state environmental groups. And then that was working well. We were able to both continue working on the issues that PIRG has always cared about and make progress there, and do more to protect our environment that we all love. So we took that nationwide. So Environment America today is a national network with offices in 30 states. We just launched Alaska Environment a couple years ago and are continuing to look at new places we can work to protect the environment. And similar to PIRG, we have a national lobbying office here in DC. And, I think the two organizations are really complementary. There are some problems that certainly both PIRG and Environment America can work on together. One of those is a few years ago, we were part of a major nationwide effort with many, many other organizations to pass the biggest ever investment in clean energy in this country through the Inflation Reduction Act. And, we have the power to power all of our lives many times over in this country with clean, renewable wind power, solar panels, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, other clean technologies. But we're still barely scratching the surface on that potential, which means consumers are still paying far more for power than we need to. And we're all getting more air pollution, health impacts, and of course, climate impacts than we could be. So both PIRG and Environment America worked on that law and now have teamed up to educate people about all the tax credits that we pass that can help consumers adopt solar, wind, et cetera. And so we've found having both the environmental expertise at Environment America And PIRG's, consumer resources and tips and other tools to help people take advantage of these has been really impactful.
It's a pretty wide number of issues you've worked on. I know over the years you've worked on prison reform in Missouri. You worked on educational testing standards reform. In New York, you spun off New York Public Interest Research Group to improve the New York subway system called the Strap Hangers Group, and they would rate different subway lines and be a watchdog for subway riders. And how do you explain the choice of issues? Are they done at the state level, national level? And the board of directors of these PIRGs are students. They're elected by their fellow students. They're independent of the university where the students go to. They're independent, nonprofit groups.
Well, Ralph, I'd say we're still inspired by the observation you made many years ago that America has more problems than it should tolerate and more solutions than we're using. And the particular types of problems we're focused on are ones that really have been created, in a sense, by our success as a country in growing, right? We're the wealthiest country the world has ever seen. We figured out how to grow more than enough food than we can eat, produce more than enough clothing than we can wear, certainly more than enough plastic, one big problem we're focused on. And all of this abundance is leading to new types of problems, including, for example, plastic pollution. So those are the types of problems that we focus on, the problems that have either come about because of the progress we've made as a society, and now we've got the ability to tackle them, or problems where, like clean energy is an example, where they're problems that we newly have the ability to solve that problem of the pollution from fossil fuels, whereas 100 years ago, we might have thought it was a problem, but didn't have anything we could do about it. So, certainly first and foremost in that category is our work on plastic pollution. We produce and toss an astonishing amount of single-use stuff, whether that's, foam coffee cups or plastic cups, takeout containers, plastic bags. Once we're done with all these single-use items, usually just after a few minutes, we throw them away, but there's really no away, right? Only a very small percentage of plastic gets recycled, 9%. About 12% gets incinerated, which also has some environmental health harms there. And the rest of it, about 79%, ends up in landfills or in our natural environment. And most of these products, right, are things that are not making our lives considerably better. We think that, it's simply not worth it to be producing things that we only use for 5 minutes that then wind up polluting our environment and causing harm to us and to wildlife for hundreds of years. So for many years, PIRG has worked on policies to improve recycling, and more recently policies to reduce our use of single-use plastic and make sure that things that we are producing, that companies are responsible for that waste that's created. And I think this is definitely one of those problems that has only existed for a few decades now, as we've figured out how to produce more and more stuff, but we also now have the tools to solve it.
PIRGs are also into pre-cycling, which isn't a word people often hear about, and it's called the right to repair efforts, which had some success. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So our Right to Repair campaign tackles a really simple problem, which is that you should be able to fix the things that you own. But too often, when your phone or your laptop breaks, you can only take it to the company that originally produced that item, and they tell you, you know what, it's going to be more expensive to fix it. You should just buy a new one. It's really obvious why that would be in the company's interest. It's definitely not in the consumer's interest. We spend billions of dollars on these products and we can't fix them. And it's also a huge waste issue. E-waste is the fastest growing stream of waste, and Americans are throwing away 416,000 phones per day. It's pretty unfathomable. And so we think people should have the ability to fix their stuff. We started campaigning on this a few years ago with that really simple idea that we should get access to the tools, parts, and information that we need to fix that device yourself or take it to a repair shop of your choosing. And the problem doesn't just affect phones and computers. It also affects tractors that farmers rely on for their livelihoods. It affected ventilators in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic that were broken, that we were, needing to rely on to keep people alive. So this is a pretty serious issue. We've had some huge wins in the states recently. PIRG has been running right to repair bills in more than half of states all across the country, including even some states where we don't have student activists or state advocates, but it's such an important idea that lawmakers wanted to take up this bill and work us. So first to say, in September, we passed legislation in the state of California after a 6-year campaign, giving people the ability to repair many of their devices. Key to that victory was we had finally built up enough support all across the state and, across both parties, that Apple, which had been, one of the strong opponents of right to repair, came on board and, accepted the legislation that we were proposing through the state.
Just to turn it to the other subject in interest of time, Lisa Frank, NYPIRG in New York is part of a coalition to stop rebating every day $40 to $50 million of a tiny 0.1% sales tax on Wall Street stock transactions. And since 1981, hundreds of billions of dollars have been rebated electronically the moment they're collected by the state of New York due to Wall Street pressure. And NYPIRG is part of a coalition to stop the rebate, keep the money, and put it in education, health, environment, labor protection, mass transit, which are badly needed of funds. We're talking about at least $15 billion a year, listeners. If listeners want to find out more, how can people find out more? Give the website.
The website is very short. It's pirg.org, PIRG.org. And that's where you can find the latest updates on our campaigns, including victories on right to repair. If you're a young person looking to get into this kind of work, either for the summer or for your career, you can go to pirg.org/jobs. And we've got some exciting positions we're hiring for right now. And there's also a place on that website where you can sign up for updates on these and all of our other important campaigns.
Listeners should know that the public interest research groups run by students use all the tools of democracy that they can reach. They litigate, they lobby, they publicize, they negotiate with companies to turn around their behavior, and they've even had some state referendums. So they're training thousands of young people in citizen skills, and over the years, these young people have gone into full-time citizen work. They've been elected to state legislatures. You see their efforts all over. As one person once told me, once a purger, always a purger. David?
There are the big victories, OSHA, the Clean Water Act, but then there are also the baby steps that lead up to these big victories. So, Lisa, how do you define a good day so you don't get discouraged? What is a good day?
So I would say, sitting from my perch here in Washington, D.C., it's very difficult to make progress here. So when we're looking at bills that are going through Congress, we're looking at, does it make some considerable difference on the issue that moves the ball forward, even if we're maybe not solving the whole problem? So one example, a few years ago, we helped pass a bipartisan law to invest in this country's infrastructure and, upgrade infrastructure all across the country. And that law included some really big wins, including restoring the polluter pays tax on the Superfund program. That means polluters, not taxpayers, are paying to clean up toxic waste sites. That was a big unqualified win. There were also some baby steps, right? A little bit of funding here for transit, a little bit of funding for more electric vehicles, stations on nation's highways. And so all of those things we know help solve the problems that we're trying to solve, and we keep at it. I also find, because we're able to work in so many forums, it's rare that a day goes by where there isn't some progress that's been made in a state capitol somewhere or on a campus that is starting to reduce their plastic use. And we all share those updates regularly with ourselves, with the public, because I think it's important for people to know that these problems are solvable and are getting solved in bits and pieces every day by people just like them.
Well, on that note, we need to conclude. We've been speaking with Lisa Frank, who's the Vice President of National Public Interest Research Group. A tip of our hat to Doug Phelps, whose fundraising and wise advice over the years to the PIRG movement needs to be recognized once in a while. And before we leave, Lisa, can you slowly give our listeners not only the website, but any particular report that you think they need to obtain or is online?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me, Ralph, and for starting this movement that has enabled so many people to do such good for the world. People can find out more about our work at pirg.org. That's PIRG.org. And many of the reports and campaigns we talked about today, you'll see a tag that says Beyond Plastic on the left-hand side. If you click on that, You'll see all of our latest work on these issues dealing with waste, plastic, recycling.
And is there a special website for the environmental group?
Yes, that website is environmentamerica.org.
That's easy to remember, environmentamerica.org. Thank you very much, Lisa Frank, for joining us and opening up some frontiers of optimism for our listeners.
Thanks for having me.
We've been speaking with Lisa Frank. We will link to her work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to speak to Chris Hedges, who has been visiting college encampments protesting the genocide in Gaza. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, May 17, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. For years, hospitals and surgery centers waited to perform procedures before sending bills to patients. That often left them chasing after patients for payment, repeatedly sending invoices, and enlisting debt collectors. Now, more hospitals and surgery centers are demanding patients pay in advance. That's according to a report in the Wall Street Journal. Advance billing helps the hospitals avoid hounding patients to settle up, yet it is distressing patients who must come up with thousands of dollars while struggling with serious conditions. Those who can't come up with the sums have been forced to put off procedures. Some who paid up discovered later they were overcharged and had to fight for refunds. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. If you want to find out what's going on in a pro-ceasefire encampment, would you ask a school administrator who's hiding behind riot cops and tear gas? Or would you ask the actual protesters who are there? David?
Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He's the host of the Chris Hedges Report, and is a prolific author. His most recent book is The Greatest Evil is War. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Chris Hedges.
Thank you, David.
Welcome back. You've just produced a 4,000-word article that really is gripping, interviewing some of the student protest leaders on the Gaza disaster at Columbia and Princeton. You were quite impressed by them in terms of their knowledge. Can you give us a summary of what you elicited from them in your interview?
Yeah, they were very impressive, and they understand the nature of settler colonial regimes. The expansion or inclusion of students from wider backgrounds that were traditionally there at places like Princeton when you were there, Ralph, has really added a kind of depth and expanded the understanding within the university. So they see what's happening in Gaza and they draw, rightly, connections to what we did to Native Americans, what the British did in India, what the British did in Kenya, what the French did in Algeria. And of course, they are correct. They have defied quite courageously the administrations of their universities, who are kind of like the political class, bought and paid for by the Israel lobby, and in particular, wealthy donors, the Democratic Party. And that is why these universities have responded to these nonviolent protests the way they have, with such overwhelming and draconian use of force. We saw, for instance, on the campus of Columbia, police enter Hamilton Hall, which had been occupied, and renamed Hind Hall for the little 6-year-old girl who was killed with her family in the car, with their guns drawn. And I was frustrated. I spent a fair bit of time, especially at the Princeton encampment, frustrated that at best, the voices of these students were, by the most of the media, captured just in sound bites, and much of the time just mischaracterized and demonized. And my old employer, the New York Times, is guilty of this, as if these encampments are about anti-Semitism or as if they are driven by outside agitators. This is just a kind of canard to deflect attention from the genocide and the appalling facilitation of this genocide by the U.S. government. Biden, of course, now just giving another $1 billion worth of weaponry. As you know, Ralph spent 7 years covering in Gaza. I was also in Sarajevo during the war. So in Sarajevo, we were hit with about 300 to 400 Serbian shells a day, constant sniper fire. Well, that resulted in about 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. Juxtapose that with Gaza, an area, a tiny area, 5 miles wide, 20 miles long, hundreds and hundreds of dead and wounded a day. And as you have correctly pointed out, as I also believe, I think the numbers of those killed are higher than the official figures, partly because, or mostly because, the government in what's left of the government in Gaza only counts figures that are reported to morgues and hospitals, most of which no longer exist. So I think you've used the number of 200,000. I think that's probably right. Many people, or some of the people I know in Gaza, have been missing now for weeks and weeks. We've not heard from them. I assume that they're not counted as dead, but they're probably buried under the rubble. So the saturation bombing, it dwarfs anything we've seen probably since Vietnam. But of course, that was over a much wider area. It's just absolutely appalling. And other than Yemen and the students on our universities, nobody's really standing up to do much to stop it.
Let's examine something that hasn't been much reported. Israeli reporters have said that the Israeli soldiers that are sent into the West Bank year after year, night after night, and more recently into Gaza, are screened to make sure they have no sense of mercy, no sense of hesitation, no compassion. They're screened so that only the soldiers who are the most brutal and who have no compunctions of blowing up whole families and homes and ambulances and hospitals and all the things that have been reported. You were over there. You saw some of that brutality. The soldiers that don't meet the test are kept back in Israel for the backup. There's always several backup soldiers for every soldier in the theater of fighting. This has not been reported, but you saw that in action, didn't you?
Yeah, that's why they draw, within the occupied territories, they draw more and more from the settler population. These are colonists who have seized Palestinian land and are continuing to seize Palestinian land, expanding the land that Israel controls in the West Bank. They already have about 60% of the West Bank. And the racism runs very, very deep. The animosity runs very, very deep. The settlers can shoot, to beat, to dispossess Palestinians of their land and property with utter impunity. We also saw, if you look at, for instance, the conflict in Algeria between the French and the Algerians, or the British in Kenya, they would also draw from settlers, from colonists, from people who live in there, because that brutality that you mentioned characterizes the relationship between the settlers and those who live on the land that they are dispossessing. But yes, of course, you're right. I mean, I will say that's true in every army, including the U.S. Army. In our 60,000 sort of elite special forces type units, they certainly breed out anybody with much compassion or empathy. I mean, this is the interesting thing about Pat Tillman, who volunteered with his brother as a ranger and saw it. And of course, they were terrified that he would speak out. He was killed in a so-called friendly fire incident. But what's interesting is that the military immediately burned all of his diaries and notes, and we don't know what was in there, but we can guess. So you're right.
This is in Afghanistan. This is Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, yeah. So, yeah, you're very right. But that's often true in any military. You want people who lack a conscience and have the capacity to kill without remorse. But that's exactly what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza.
Let's go to another subject, which is the sudden collapse of the border security of Israel on the border with Gaza on October 7th. This border security was touted by experts as being world-class, nothing like it. Technologically, detection instruments, personal monitors, spies, informants everywhere. And the Netanyahu regime had the plans a year in advance by Hamas in great detail. And then suddenly, all of this human intelligence, technological detection equipment warnings collapsed on October 7th. And if it didn't collapse, there would have been no disaster that we're talking about, all the fighting in the Middle East And this is why 3 out of 4 Israelis despise Netanyahu, because he failed them. He failed to protect them. What is your view? And why do you think the New York Times and Washington Post are not probing deeper into this?
Yes, it's an egregious intelligence failure, much like 9/11. That intelligence failure was then capitalized or weaponized, in our case, to invade Iraq, which of course had nothing to do with 9/11, which was long the plan of the neocons, including Joe Biden, by the way, who called for the invasion of Iraq 5 years before we invaded Iraq. So the same thing happened in Israel. It was arrogance, hubris. We had all sorts of warning signs about an imminent attack in 9/11, which we ignored, in the same way the Israelis felt that the Palestinians, or even though they got a kind of blueprint of the plan, that they felt that the Palestinians were just not capable of carrying out an operation like that. There was an over-reliance on their electronic surveillance equipment that would also replicate 9/11. We had no human assets inside of al-Qaeda. The French did. We didn't. It was all electronic surveillance. We understood there was chatter, but we didn't know what it meant. We didn't know what was happening. I think the same was true with Israel. And of course, the Palestinians were able to target those cameras and communication systems, which rendered the Israelis essentially deaf, dumb, and blind for many hours as to what was happening. And the Israelis had also transferred large numbers of soldiers to the West Bank to protect particular settler activity there. So, but I would say it's hubris. I don't think that they planned it. But I think, and this, of course, is why Netanyahu is blocking any kind of an investigation, because it was a massive intelligence failure, but it did give essentially the extreme right-wing government of Netanyahu the excuse to do something they've long wanted to do, and that is ethnically cleanse Gaza. And if they can succeed there, they will try and do it in the West Bank. There's a kind of creeping expansion of settlements and escalation of violence in the West Bank. So we know what the intent is. They'll be able to achieve either in Gaza or the West Bank, but it's pretty clear that's what they want.
As well as East Jerusalem. So what do you think the people in the United States should be doing here? They're being taxed to fund this genocide by a foreign country, Israel. Pretty extraordinary. The Israeli government just sends the White House and Congress the bill and says, pay for it. And the majority in Congress click their heels, forget about all the needs back home domestically, and send those tax dollars and those weapons of mass destruction over there. You've been known for your realism. Some call it a darker view of the future. What do you see happening, and what do you see can change the situation?
Well, the Democratic Party is completely apathetic about catering in any real way to its voter base. It uses the fear of Trump as the way to kind of sheep herd reluctant voters into the booth. That is the strategy they have employed in the past. That is the strategy they are employing now. What spooks them are the demonstrations, and that's why they have responded, arresting, 2,800 students, violently shutting down encampments, allowing Zionist mobs, such as at UCLA, to beat and use pepper spray and bear spray on nonviolent protesters in an encampment as the police stand by and do nothing. I mean, that's collusion on the part of university officials. But the demonstrations have spooked them. And that's what we have to continue, of course, including at Chicago, where the Democratic convention is scheduled to be held in July. After they shut down the encampment in Columbia and they violently, including throwing one student down the stairs and knocking him unconscious, several students going to the hospital for injuries, and when they reoccupied Hamilton Hall, the Columbia students immediately said our next step is to organize general strikes on universities among staff, faculty, and students to shut the universities down. In that sense, it's different from Zuccotti. Bloomberg was able to clear out the Occupy encampment, of course, in a nationally coordinated effort, physically cleared out the encampments. You can't do that at universities. I mean, they have that space, they own it, and they can use it. Although Columbia right now is under police occupation, I was just up there. You can't enter the campus, even if you're a student, unless you live in one of the residence halls. All the classes are virtual. They can't go to their labs. So they're spooked. They're spooked, not by voter dissatisfaction, but by the movements that have just not rippled across the country and universities across the country, but also globally. So that's what we have to continue to do. I don't think in the short term we're going to stop the weapons systems going into Israel. About 68% of the munitions that Israel receives comes from the United States. But I think in the long term, this is fatal for Israel because the next generation isn't buying it. They see the Zionist project for what it is. So in the short term, I'm pessimistic. In the long term, I think that this will make it harder and harder for the apartheid state of Israel to do what it's doing to the Palestinians. That, unfortunately, is not going to help the Palestinians in Gaza, clearly creating a humanitarian crisis of such catastrophic proportions that Palestinians are forced to choose between deportation, permanent exile, or death. That is the option. And now, of course, Israel has seized the Rafah border crossing, which means that they have the capacity to funnel desperate Palestinians over the border into the Egyptian Sinai.
The worst hardliners are the GOP in Congress. I mean, the kind of statements coming out are so viciously anti-Semitic against the Arabs in Palestine that the Capitol Hill Citizen has chosen 10 of the worst with the pictures of the members of Congress who have said it. Like Senator Tom Cotton said, I wouldn't mind if the Israelis made the rubble bounce in Gaza. He said that in October and has never retracted it. The cruelty is spiced by the hypocrisy of Congress passing 5 laws in past that are being violated by Joe Biden's administration by sending unconditional weaponry and political cover to the Israelis. The Leahy Amendment prohibits, for example, sending weapons to countries that violate human rights. And you have Congress that passed these 5 laws that are being violated with the result of huge death and destruction overseas, and not just in Gaza, but places like Iraq and Libya in the past. And they're talking about students trespassing on their own university and nonviolent protests. The problem starts in Congress. They're the funders, the enablers, the surrenders of their constitutional rights of oversight and war-making powers. What do you think should be done before we conclude in terms of vectoring the student protests with 2,000 congressional student interns about to go to Congress for the summer?
Mobilizing those interns is a good idea. They all come out of these university settings. I think the Democrats have to pay. I mean, I spent so much time in Gaza. This is not genocide is just not a forgivable offense. It's a moral issue. It's not even a political issue. And I can't support people who enable genocide, especially a genocide that has taken the lives of people I know. So I think we have to do everything within our power to defy the enablers of genocide in both of the parties. It's not a policy issue. That is something that is unacceptable. It presages a world where there is no humanitarian law, there is no international law. I think that's why so much of the global South has reacted the way it has. Not only has it, within its own historical memory, been a victim of settler colonial regimes, but it sees the global North building these kind of climate forces and using its industrial weapons to slaughter entire peoples as a kind of harbinger of what will come with the breakdown of the climate, mass migrations, declining crop yields, floods, droughts, and everything else. So I think this is an issue that extends beyond Gaza, and it's one that we have to fight with, every fiber within us.
Well, anybody who doubts that it's genocide and doubts the plausible findings of the International Court only has to review the orders to the military by Netanyahu's ministers after October 7th, when they said, and this is not rhetoric, these are the words of genocide, when they said, no food, no water, no medicine, no electricity, no fuel. These people are human animals and will be treated accordingly. So the vast number of Palestinians in Gaza had nothing to do with October 7th, just wanted to raise their families and get through the day, are being slaughtered in unprecedented numbers, according to human rights specialists and World Health specialists who've spoken about this. The death toll, listeners, is far, far greater than the formal fatality count by Hamas, which wants an undercount because it doesn't want to be criticized even more by its people for not being able to protect them and even provide shelters for over 2 million people who have been displaced and are living in tents or just open to the elements with their families. Thank you very much, Chris Hedges. Tell us how people can get that 4,000-word article.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on it. It's an important article because I really wanted to give the depth and, range of understanding by these protesters. It's chrishedges.substack.com, and the article is called The Nation's Conscience.
There you have it. It's very worthwhile reading because so much of what Chris Hedges writes you'll never see in the mainstream press, and it's very, very well documented. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Chris Hedges. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Sam Simon, Lisa Frank, and Chris Hedges. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode. We might not like them all, but we read them all.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. The latest edition of Capitol Citizen is out. You can get a copy by going to capitolcitizen.com for $5 or more if you wish. You'll get a print copy, 40 pages, with a front page article by me on how to turn Congress around. I call it the fundamental reform of Congress. You can get extra copies as well if you want to form discussion circles and become Capitol Hill citizens watchdogging Congress by yourself.
Step up. I think that you should step up. Rise up and take over power. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, stand up. Step up. You ought to step